Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. Welcome to episode 41. This episode is entitled Naming the Unnameable. You know, there's a moment early in every difficult custody evaluation when I ask a child a specific question, not a jarring question, not a leading question, something simple and open, something like, tell me about a time you had fun with your father, or what do you and your mother like to do together? And what I listen for in that moment is not just the content of the answer. I listen for the architecture of the answer, for the texture, for what is present and what is conspicuously absent. A child who has lost a parent to divorce, who grieves, who is confused, who is managing the ordinary and the extraordinary difficulty of a family's dissolution, that child's answer has a particular quality. It has memory in it, sensory detail, ambivalence, the present tense brushing against the past tense. The answer sounds like a child. An alienated child's answer sounds like something else. It sounds, if you have heard it enough times, like a prepared statement. The words are too clean. The affect is too certain. The history has been edited down to a verdict. In our first episode, I introduced the clinical picture of parental alienation through a composite case and laid out why, despite 4 decades of documentation, the phenomenon remains contested. Today we go deeper. We build the foundation. Today we do 2 things simultaneously. We trace the intellectual foundation that explains why alienation works, the theoretical architecture from Freud through Bowlby through Mahler to Gardner, and we map that clinical taxonomy or pattern that tells us what alienation looks like when we encounter it. Segment 1 of this podcast, the architecture of attachment. To understand why parental alienation is possible, why a child can be turned against a parent who has done nothing to justify that, you have to begin with what John Bowlby understood about the nature of the parent-child attachment. Bowlby was a British psychiatrist and psychoanalyst working in the middle decades of the 20th century. His attachment theory, developed across 3 foundational volumes published between 1996 and 1980, was built on a deceptively simple observation that the human infant's tie to its caregiver is not a secondary or derivative phenomenon. It's not merely a byproduct of the caregiver providing food and warmth. The attachment bond is primary. It's biologically wired. It is, in the most literal sense, a survival mechanism. The infant who maintains proximity to a protective adult survives. The infant who does not, does not. Natural selection over hundreds of thousands of years built an organism that is exquisitely, desperately oriented towards the attachment figure. When the attachment figure is present and responsive, the child has a secure base from which to explore the world. When the attachment figure is absent or threatening, the child experiences something that Bowlby described as separation anxiety. A genuine alarm response rooted in the same neurobiology as physical pain. What Bowlby means for the alienated child. Holding that in mind, the idea that the parent-child bond is biologically primary, and now consider what it means to engineer its disruption. The alienating parent is not merely introducing the child to negative information about the other parent. They are doing something far more profound. They are intervening at the level of the child's most fundamental relational architecture. They are telling the child, in effect, that the attachment figure they are wired to love and seek is not safe to love, that the proximity-seeking behavior that evolution built into them is dangerous, that the secure base is not secure. The child's response to this intervention is not simply cognitive. It's not a matter of updating beliefs on the basis of new experience or evidence. It's a response to what amounts to a threat to the attachment system itself. And the child responds to threats to the attachment system with fear, with defensive reorganization. And this is the critical clinical point with compliance. The child complies to survive. A child who is dependent on one parent for safety and survival will, when that parent communicates explicitly or implicitly that the other parent is dangerous, unsafe, or contemptible, reorganize their attachment behavior accordingly, not because they have evaluated the evidence and reached a conclusion, because survival requires alignment with the available attachment figure. The alienated child is not making a free choice. They are executing a survival strategy. The tragedy is that they cannot know the difference. Segment 2, Separation, Splitting, and the Developmental Stakes. Margaret Mahler and the Separation Individuation Process. Margaret Mahler, the Hungarian-American psychoanalyst and pediatrician, whose observable research in the 1960s and 1970s became foundational to our understanding of early child development, described a process she called separation individuation, the gradual, stage-governed process by which an infant differentiates itself from the mother and develops a stable, coherent sense of self. This process, which Mahler traced through several sub-phases across roughly the first 3 years of life, depends critically on what she called the good enough availability of a stable, emotionally consistent caregiver, a formulation she shared with D.W. Winnicott, whose parallel work on transitional phenomenon and maternal holding environments extended to the same core insight. The child who navigates separation individuation successfully arrives at what Mahler called object constancy, the capacity to hold a stable mental representation of the caregiver even in the caregiver's absence, and crucially, to maintain that representation as good even when the caregiver is frustrating or temporarily unavailable. Object constancy is not a minor developmental achievement. It is the psychological foundation for the capacity to maintain stable relationships across time and stress. It is the foundation for emotional regulation, for the tolerance of ambivalence, for the ability to hold a complex and realistic view of another person, neither idealized nor demonized. Object constancy, splitting, and what alienation exploits. In Chapter 1, I described what I called a splitting defense. In the alienated child, the presentation of one parent as entirely good and the other as entirely bad, without the ambivalence or complexity that characterizes healthy relational experience. I want to be more precise about that observation now. Splitting, in object relations theory, is a primitive defense mechanism. Primitive in the sense that it is developmentally early, characteristic of the pre-object constancy stage, and regressive when it appears in children who have already achieved more integrated relational functioning. It is the mind's way of managing overwhelming anxiety about a relationship by cleaving it. This person is all good, this person is all bad. The ambivalence is resolved by elimination. In normal development, splitting is gradually replaced by integration, by the capacity to hold the frustrating and the gratifying in the same object, to maintain the relationship across the good times and the bad times. This integration is precisely what object constancy represents. Parental alienation, when it is effective, induces a regression to splitting. It does this not by creating a genuine reason to fear or hate the targeted parent, but by exploiting the child's developmental architecture, the residual vulnerability to split, and that persists at varying degrees throughout childhood. The alienating parent does not need to manufacture elaborate evidence of the targeted parent's wrongdoing. They need only to activate consistently and repeatedly the child's anxiety about the safety of that attachment, and the splitting defense does the rest. The more developmentally vulnerable the child, the younger, the more insecurely attached, the more dependent on the alienating parent's approval, the more efficiently this process operates. This is why Gardner's observation that alienation tends to be most severe and most rapid in children with certain pre-existing developmental profiles. It is not merely anecdotal. It is predicted by the theoretical architecture. The theory and the clinical patterns are not on parallel tracks. They are on the same track, viewed from different vantage points. I want to turn now to Sigmund Freud, not as a figure of general intellectual reverence, but as a specific object lesson in what rigorous clinical thinking demands when the evidence does not cooperate with our preferred conclusions. In 1896, Freud presented to the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna a paper he called The Etiology of Hysteria. The argument was bold and at the time scandalous that the neurotic symptoms he observed in his patients were without exception the direct consequence of actual childhood sexual abuse. Freud called this the seduction theory. The seductions in question were not consensual. They were assaults, typically by adult male relatives, perpetrated on young children who had been unable to process the experience and had repressed it. The theory was received with hostility. His colleague, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, called it a scientific fairy tale. Freud was professionally isolated, and within 18 months, by September 1897, in a famous letter to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, Freud had abandoned it. His reasons are worth examining carefully because they are the reasons of a serious scientist, not a man retreating from an uncomfortable position. He had observed in his clinical practice that the unconscious does not distinguish between actual memories and fantasy. What a patient reports as a recovered memory of an early event may be, with equal conviction and equally emotional intensity, a constructed narrative, a fantasy, a wish, a fear, elaborated over time into something that presents to the conscious mind with all the characteristics of a real memory. He had observed that his patients' accounts, under the pressure of the analytic process, were not stable, that the seducers changed, the events shifted, the narratives that had seemed solid began to demonstrate the plasticity of constructed rather than retrieved experience. He wrote to Fliess, "I no longer believe in my neurotic." I want to be unambiguous about what Freud's revision does and does not mean, because it has been misread in both directions. It does not mean that child sexual abuse is rare, or that children disclosures of abuse should be regarded with automatic skepticism, or that the reports of abused children are unreliable. The clinical and the empirical literature on child sexual abuse is extensive and does not support any such conclusion. Some children are genuinely abused. What Freud's revision means, and this is the lesson that a forensic evaluator must carry into every room where a child is interviewed, is that a child's sincere, detailed, emotionally charged account of events does not, by itself, establish the historical reality of those events. The subjective experience of memory is not a reliable guide to the objective truth of what was remembered. The unconscious, or in a more contemporary cognitive term, the memory system, is constructive, not reproductive. It builds representations, and those representations can be built from experience or from suggestion or from the intersection of both, with the seams invisible to the person carrying the memory. The forensic evaluator's job is not to believe the child. It is not to disbelieve the child. It's to evaluate what produced the child's account. And those are three entirely different enterprises. This principle is the essential foundation of rigorous forensic work in parental alienation cases. When a child says with conviction and distress that their father frightened them or their mother neglected them, the evaluator's task is not to adjudicate the claim on the basis of the child's certainty. The task is to ask, what is the source of this account? What conditions produced it? Has it been stable across time and contexts, or does it shift and amplify in proximity to one parent? Are there adults in the child's environment whose own grievances and anxieties could have seeded or cultivated this? Freud gave us the question. The contemporary research on memory, suggestibility, forensic interviewing, which we'll examine in a later episode, gives us the methodology for answering it. The systemization, Richard Gardner, and the systemization of the phenomenon. Richard Gardner was a clinical professor of child psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He was a prolific author, a chess master, a musician, and one of the most observant clinicians of his generation. He did not discover parental alienation. He named it, described it with unprecedented precision, and built the first systematic clinical taxonomy or pattern for evaluating and classifying it. We'll spend an entire episode on Gardner, the man, and on the disinformation campaign that has been waged against his legacy. But for now, I want to focus on the pattern itself, because it is a work of genuine clinical craft, and because understanding it is the prerequisite to everything else this series does. Gardner first described parental alienation syndrome in a 1985 article and developed a full taxonomy across his 1992 and 1998 texts. The model has two primary components, a set of 8 behavioral symptoms observable in a child, and a 3-level severity classification that determines both the clinical picture and the appropriate intervention. Why 8 symptoms, and why this pattern? Before I walk through Gardner's 8 symptoms, I want to note something about their theoretical coherence. These are not a checklist assembled from clinical anecdote. Each symptom maps onto a specific developmental or relational mechanism that the child development architecture we've been building explains. The campaign of denigration maps onto the splitting defense. The frivolous rationalizations map onto the borrowed language of an adult's grievance system. The absence of ambivalence maps onto the regressive loss of object constancy. The extension of rejection to the targeted parent's family maps on to the logic of splitting, contamination by association. The independent thinker phenomenon maps onto the internalization of the alienating parent's programming as a self-generated belief. The absence of guilt maps onto the dissociation of the child's natural ambivalence. The symptoms follow because they are products of the same underlying process. Gardner did not simply observe a list of behaviors. He observed a syndrome, a constellation with internal logic, and named the process generating it. The 8 primary behavioral symptoms, or as I refer to them as pattern of behavior. The first symptom is the campaign of denigration, not the expression of grievance, not the articulation of hurt, but a sustained, organized, frequently intense devaluation of the targeted parent, which the child presents as self-evident and beyond question. The targeted parent is not merely flawed, they are essentially and irredeemably bad. The second is weak, frivolous, or absurd rationalizations for the deprecation. The rationalizations offered for the rejection do not withstand clinical scrutiny. They are often trivial, matters of personal taste, minor irritations, issues that in no reasonable assessment would justify the severity of the rejection. Or they are serious on the surface, but under gentle questioning reveal themselves to be borrowed narratives with no grounding in the child's actual experience. In other words, they are false. The third is absence of ambivalence. As I discussed earlier, healthy relational experience, particularly towards parents, is inherently ambivalent. The alienated child presents a picture of absolute, unmodulated negative feelings toward the targeted parent and absolute, unmodulated positive feelings toward the alienating parent. This purity is clinically suspicious. It is not what children sound like. It's not what normal children do. The fourth is the independent thinker phenomenon. The child insists that their views are entirely their own, that the alienating parent has not influenced them, that they have come to their conclusions independently and spontaneously. This claim is made even when the child's language, arguments, and specific accusations mirror the alienating parent's almost verbatim. The insistence on autonomy is, paradoxically, one of the most reliable indicators of programming. Genuine independent thought does not typically announce itself. Children will come into an evaluation and they'll say, "Nobody told me to say this, but my father is really a bad person." The fifth is reflexive support for the alienating parent in any conflict. The child automatically takes the alienating parent's side in any dispute, past, present, or hypothetically, without consideration of the merits of the specific situation. This reflexive alignment is not based on evaluation. It's a loyalty response to the attachment dynamic. The sixth is the absence of guilt about the treatment of the targeted parent. A child who announces the worthlessness of a parent they once loved, who refuses to attend a grandparent's funeral, who rejects an extended family that has shown them only affection, and reports no guilt, no discomfort, no sadness about any of this. In the developmental terms, this absence of guilt is not stoicism. It is a dissociation from the child's own moral sensibility, which has been yielded to the programming. The seventh is the presence of borrowed scenarios in language. The child uses adult vocabulary and adult legal framing, adult psychological terminology. The specific accusations map sometimes with forensic precision onto the grievance of the alienating parent. The child has not generated these narratives from experience. They have absorbed them and now report them as memory. The eighth, which Gardner identified as the most diagnostically significant, is the spread of animosity to the targeted parent's extended family and support network. Grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, longtime family friends, people the child loved, and with whom the child had independent, positive relationships, became tainted by association. The splitting is totalized. No single symptom constitutes a diagnosis. The syndrome is the configuration. It is the pattern of symptoms, their coherence, and their relationships to the family context that the evaluator must assess. The three severity level. Gardner classified alienation severity across 3 levels: mild, moderate, and severe. The classification matters clinically because the appropriate intervention differs substantially across levels, and because the prognosis, the question of whether the parent-child relationship can be repaired, is substantially different at each level. In mild cases, the child's alienating behaviors are present but relatively superficial. The child still has positive experiences with a targeted parent and is capable of expressing affection when in that parent's presence and away from the alienating parent's influence. The alienating parent's programming is present, but the child's attachment to the targeted parent has not yet been fundamentally disrupted. Therapeutic intervention at this level, combined with appropriate judicial oversight, has a genuinely good prognosis. In moderate cases, the 8 symptoms are more fully developed. The child's resistance to contact is more entrenched, the borrowed scenario is more elaborate, the absence of ambivalence more complete. The child's relationship with the targeted parent has been meaningfully damaged, though not necessarily irreparably. Intervention at this level typically requires a combination of therapeutic work, parental parenting coordination, and court involvement. In some cases, a separation from the alienating parent is necessary for the child to reestablish his or her relationship with the rejected parent. In severe cases, the child's rejection is absolute and the programming deeply internalized. The child may have absorbed the alienating parent's narrative so completely that the manufactured reality has become, for them, simple reality. At this level, the child may refuse all contact with the targeted parent, may behave with open hostility during forced contact, and may show signs of genuine emotional dysregulation when the rejection cannot be enacted. The intervention at the severe level typically includes a period of no contact between the child and the alienating parent, along with specialized clinical and legal undertakings, and without it, the prognosis for the parent-child relationship is poor. Segment 5 of this podcast, Synthesis and Closure. Let me pull the threads of this episode together. We began with Bowlby and the evolutionary logic of the attachment bond, the understanding that the infant's tie to caregiver is primary, biologically wired, and exquisitely sensitive to threat. We then turned to Mahler and the separation-individuation process, the developmental architecture through which the child constructs a stable self in relation to the caregiver and through which object constancy is capable to hold a whole, realistic, ambivalent representation of the other is gradually achieved. From there we went to Freud, not for his developmental theory, though that is relevant, but for the cognitive lesson embedded in his most important act of scientific self-correction, the seduction theory. The seduction theory revision gives us a principle that is foundational to rigorous forensic work, that the sincerity and intensity of a child's reported memory or belief does not establish its historical accuracy. The clinician's obligation is to evaluate the source of the account, not simply to receive it. And from there, we turn to Gardner. Gardner's work, The 8 Behavioral Symptoms that cohere into a recognizable pattern, that the 3 severity levels that determine the clinical picture and guide intervention. What I want you to take from this episode is the following. The pattern is not arbitrary. It is predicted by the theory, and the theory is not speculative. It is grounded in the same developmental science that informs everything else we do when we evaluate children. I'm sometimes asked, especially in cross-examination, whether parental alienation is real. The question is usually posed as though it were a serious challenge. My answer is always the same. Is the attachment system real? Yes. Decades of neuroscience, developmental psychology, and evolutionary biology confirm it. Is the splitting defense real? Yes. It's observable, measurable, and theoretically well-grounded. Is the constructive nature of human memory real? Yes, it is perhaps the most replicated finding in cognitive and social psychology. Is a child's behavioral and emotional compliance with an attachment figure's expressed emotional agenda real? Yes, it is visible in every developmental observation of infants and toddlers. If all of those things are real, and they are, then parental alienation, as the process by which those mechanisms are exploited to sever a child's relationship with a targeted parent, is not only real, it is, given the theoretical architecture, almost inevitable under the right conditions. If all of those things are real, and they are, then parental alienation as a process by which those mechanisms are exploited to sever a child's relationship with a targeted parent is not only real, it is, given the theoretical architecture, almost inevitable under the right conditions. The question has never been whether alienation happens. The question has always been whether we were willing to look at it clearly. Gardner looked. He described what he saw with precision and courage. The work of this series is to carry that description forward into the courtroom, into clinical practice, into the public understanding of what is being done to children in contested custodial proceedings across the country. In the next episode, we turn to Gardner himself, the man, the scholar, the clinical thinker, and the target of one of the most sustained and dishonest disinformation campaigns in recent clinical history. We'll examine what he actually wrote, what was done to his reputation, and why the distortion of his legacy has cost the children he spent his career trying to protect. The episode is called The Man They Had to Destroy. Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.drbobevans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.